Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission is always to give you the shortcut to being well-informed, and today we are tackling something really, really useful. How do you evaluate a product's usability without a single live user in the room?
That is the core question, isn't it? And it's so important for being efficient. We're diving into the source material that covers these non-user evaluation methods. You can really think of this as a trade-off. It's the battle between, say, expert judgment on one side and just raw data on the other.
Okay, so our goal here is to really break down the three fundamental pillars that designers use to do this. We're going to start with inspections. That's the expert analysis part.
Right. Then we'll move into analytics and A/B testing. That's all about the numbers, the quantitative layer. And we'll finish up with predictive models, which is where pure mathematics comes in to estimate performance.
And by the end of this, you'll get how things like heuristics, logged data like bounce rates, and even formulas like Fitts law all come together to help designers spot problems fast.
Exactly. It's all about spotting those usability issues quickly and thoroughly. All right, let's start with the human element then. Inspections. When we say inspections, what we're really talking about is leveraging that deep expert knowledge, right? The researcher is basically role-playing the user. Precisely. Inspection methods are fundamentally about domain expertise. The researchers, they draw on their knowledge of interaction design, of how users typically behave, to find those pain points before a real user ever does.
And I imagine these are most useful early on, or when you're short on time.
Absolutely. They're indispensable when you're early in the design phase, when maybe real users aren't available yet, or when your time and budget are just really tight.
So the most famous of these methods, the one everyone's heard of, is probably heuristic evaluation, HE.
It is. And the core concept is using these established usability principles, we call them heuristics, to check if all the interface elements, the dialog boxes, the menus, if they conform to these tried and tested standards. And Jakob Nielsen's 10 usability heuristics are, well, they're the classic starting point.
Now, people sometimes call these principles common sense, but common sense can be the first casualty when you're deep in a project. So what are the first few that every designer just has to know? Well, the first one is arguably the most important: visibility of system status. The user just always needs to know what's going on. They need feedback, like a loading bar or something.
Exactly. Or just a little message sent confirmation. The second is match between system and the real world. This just means using language the user understands, not system jargon. If the system throws up error 404, that's an immediate failure on this heuristic.
That makes total sense. So a travel app should use travel words, not database terms. And then we get to this idea of the user feeling like they're in control. That's number 3, user control and freedom. We need an emergency exit.
Absolutely. That's your undo, your redo, the big clear cancel button. If a user can get into a state, they have to be able to get out of it just as easily. And that ties right into number 4, consistency and standards.
So if a button looks a certain way on one page, it needs to look the same on all the others.
Yes. And number 5 is error prevention. This one is so key. A good design should proactively stop problems from ever happening, rather than just relying on good error messages after the fact.
Prevention over cure. Got it. Okay, so the rest of them deal with cognitive load and help, things like recognition rather than recall, so don't make me remember something I saw 3 screens ago.
Right. And flexibility and efficiency of use, which lets experts set up shortcuts while still helping out the beginners.
And then the last few are aesthetic and minimalist design, so no clutter, no irrelevant information. And the final 2 are about when things do go wrong. Help users recognize, diagnose, and recover from errors, so plain language, constructive solutions, and finally, help and documentation, which should be easy to search and focused on the task. It really does sound like a checklist. But the source material points out something really interesting about the process. You don't need a huge team for this. The data shows that just 3 to 5 expert evaluators can find something like 75% of the usability problems. That seems incredibly efficient.
It is, but, and this is a big but, that efficiency comes with a huge warning sign. Heuristic evaluation should complement user testing, not replace it.
Why is that?
Because studies show that sometimes evaluators report problems that wouldn't actually happen in the real world. We call them false alarms.
I was floored by this number in the source material. It said up to 43% of reported problems in some studies were false alarms, almost half. What happens if a design team acts on that kind of flawed data?
The consequences are, well, they're massive. It's wasted time, wasted money, potential design debt. You're busy fixing problems that don't exist, while the really severe ones, the ones the expert missed, are still lurking in your product.
So expert intuition is good, but it needs a guardrail.
Yeah.
Exactly. It needs stability, which is why having codified mandated standards is so crucial. And that leads us right to the gold standard for this, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG.
Right. These are probably the best known standards outside of the HCI world, really.
Yeah.
They focus on making content usable by people with disabilities. And the four main principles are summarized by the acronym POUR.
POU.
The content has to be perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. It's a framework to make sure that no matter what a user's sensory, physical, or cognitive challenges are, the design is still functional for them.
Okay, so let's move on from heuristics. What's the other main inspection method? You mentioned walkthroughs.
Yes, walkthroughs.
Yeah.
Instead of using that broad set of principles, these methods are intensely focused on a very specific task flow. The most popular one is called the cognitive walkthrough, or CW.
And what's the focus there?
The focus is all about the ease of learning. The researcher simulates the user's problem-solving process, and at every single step of a task, they try to answer a few key questions from the user's perspective. Let's break those down because they seem really important. The first one is, will the correct action be evident? So does the user even know what they're supposed to do next?
Will the user notice that the correct action is available? I mean, can they physically see the button or the link they need to click right now?
And third,
Will the user interpret the system's response correctly? After they clicked, do they understand the feedback they just got? If you can't say yes to all three of those at any given step, boom, you've found a usability problem.
then there's this really specialized one, the semiotic engineering inspection, which is all about the interface's communicative power in signs. How does that work?
This technique looks at the signifying message that the designer is sending. It breaks down the signs in an interface into three types. So imagine you're booking a flight online.
All right.
A static sign is something with instant meaning, like the text economy class or maybe the letters GMT next to the departure time. You get it instantly.
Got it. Instant meaning. What's a dynamic one?
Dynamic signs communicate meaning over time or through interaction. Think about picking a date from a drop-down calendar or watching the seating chart update as you click on a section. The meaning unfolds as you interact.
And the last type.
Metalinguistic signs. These are explanations about another sign. On that same booking site, it's the little icon you click that explains why the flight price just changed or why your luggage fee is separate. It's the designer stepping in to comment on the system.
That's a really useful distinction. Okay, and finally, there's the pluralistic walkthrough. What makes that one different?
The team. It's multidisciplinary. You have users, developers, and usability specialists all in the room together. And the crucial part is that each person writes down their proposed sequence of actions independently first, before anyone discusses it.
So you avoid that groupthink effect.
Exactly. It gives you this incredibly detailed focus on the user's task from every possible viewpoint development, expert, and real world without any initial bias. Okay, so let's shift gears completely. Moving away from expert judgment and into the purely quantitative world, analytics. This is where we start logging user actions remotely.
Right. Analytics logs everything. Keystrokes, mouse movements, how long you spend on a page. The big advantage is the sheer volume of data you can collect, and you do it unobtrusively. It gives you a big picture view of user behavior that expert inspection just can't provide at that scale.
And for web analytics specifically, we're tracking visitor behavior to optimize the site. There's on-site analytics, what people do on your site, and off-site, how visible you are on, say, Google.
And if we look at the real-world example from the source, the dashboard for i-book.com, you can really see the power of these numbers. They had, 4,723 users and over 2,200 sessions in one period. That overall bounce rate was 58.30%. And just to remind everyone, the bounce rate is the percentage of people who land on one page and then just leave immediately.
Yeah.
So that 58% is pretty typical, but the data showed something much more specific, a real failure point.
Exactly. When they segmented the data, they found that non-English speaking visitors, particularly from China, had a bounce rate of 82.86%.
Wow.
That huge jump is a massive red flag. It points to a specific, localized usability failure. It could be a bad translation, a formatting issue, maybe a cultural mismatch. Analytics tells you where the product is bleeding users, even if it can't tell you exactly why.
And these tools are getting so specific now. The source mentions learning analytics in online courses, which can track the exact lecture or quiz where students start dropping out.
Which brings us to A/B testing. This is really the gold standard for doing controlled experiments online. It's a massive experiment, often with thousands of users, where you compare two versions of a design A and B at the same time. It's a classic between subjects design.
You mentioned something before we even get to the A/B test, this idea of running an AA test first. Why is that so critical? I mean, you're just testing the same thing against itself.
Right, it sounds a bit redundant, doesn't it? But you absolutely have to do it. You need to make sure that your random population selection is actually working and that the testing conditions themselves, the whole complex infrastructure of the internet, aren't already skewing your data.
So you're checking for random noise in the system.
Precisely. If your AA test shows wildly different results between the two groups, you know your environment is too unstable to trust any data you get from a real design change.
And the risks of getting that wrong are huge. That Microsoft Office 2007 homepage example is the perfect cautionary tale. They launched a new design, hoping to increase downloads, but clicks dropped by 64%.
The team was completely baffled. They thought there must be a huge technical bug. But after they dug in, they realized the design change had introduced an unintended variable that completely warped what the user was trying to do.
What was it? The old design had a big, prominent Try 2007 for free option. It was all about evaluation. But the new design, it prominently featured the price tag, $149.95. Buy now. Oh! So the new design changed the user's goal from free trial to expensive purchase. And that one little variable, the sudden appearance of a high price, it just killed the whole experiment.
It invalidated everything. It's a perfect example of how A/B testing can tell you the what, but you still need that human insight to figure out the why. Okay, so our final pillar takes us into pure quantification. Predictive models. This is where we use mathematical formulas to estimate user performance without any users or experts at all.
This is evaluation by math and physics, really. And the most influential model here is Fitts' law.
Anyone who's ever tried to tap a tiny icon on their phone while a train is shaking understands this law intuitively. It predicts the time, t, it takes to reach a target based on the target's size, s, and the distance, d, you have to move to get to it. That's the core idea. Make the target bigger, or put it closer, and the task gets faster and easier. The actual formula is a bit more complex. It's 2dl equals k log 2, 2ds plus 1 paria, but the takeaway is simple and powerful. It guides designers on where to put buttons and how big to make them.
This is where the math gets really cool. The law actually predicts that targets in the four corners of the screen are the fastest to access. Why is that specific layout so much more efficient?
It's because of something called the pinning action. When you move your cursor or your finger toward a corner, you can't overshoot it on two sides. The edges of the screen act as a physical barrier. Functionally, that makes the target feel infinitely large in those directions, which dramatically cuts down the time it takes to hit it.
So if corners are the fastest, what's a common everyday example where Fitts' law is used to make a target effectively bigger?
A classic one is a labeled tool on a toolbar, like in Microsoft Office. Even if you recognize the tiny little icon, the text label right next to it becomes part of the clickable area. That increases the effective size, the S of the target, making it quicker to acquire. And Fitts' law is adapted for everything now. Touchscreens, game controllers, you name it.
So what does this all mean for you? We've covered three really distinct ways to evaluate a design, all without needing to recruit a single user.
We started with inspections. These are the qualitative, expert-driven methods that rely on codified knowledge, like Nielsen's 10 heuristics or the POUR principles from WCAG. They're fast, but they can be prone to those false alarms.
Then we move to analytics and A/B testing. That's the quantitative side, logging huge amounts of data to see what users are actually doing, finding those critical failure points like high bounce rates. But you have to be so careful with your experimental design.
And finally, predictive models like Fitts' law, using pure math to optimize layout and efficiency, explaining why those corner targets are so easy to hit. And it's important to remember that expert inspections and user data, they often find different kinds of problems. A mix is always best. Which brings us to a final question for you to think about. Given that we know inspection methods can have high rates of expert bias and those false alarms, should design teams start prioritizing the hard, quantifiable data from analytics and A/B testing more? Or is there still some irreplaceable value in the deep, targeted insight, the why, that only a human expert can really provide? It's that constant balancing act, isn't it, between the quality of the analysis and the sheer volume of the data, something to mull over as you start applying these ideas to your own work.
Thanks for tuning in for this deep dive from the Last Minute Lecture team. We'll catch you next time.